Once upon a time, this was long before porcupines were especially prickly. Porcupines had long, flowing manes of quills, and they were soft to the touch. And there was this one porcupine in particular named Farrah, who bore a striking resemblance to Farrah Fawcett. And it was she, Farrah the Porcupine, who was the first among all of her porcupine people to get the feathered porcupine quill look. And it was good for her, but you see, Farrah, she had fear in her heart, Farrah did. And so every time she had conflict, even little bits of conflict with family, particularly with her little brother, wasn't so little, but wasn't yet so big that he understood how to act right. And one morning over pancakes, her brother grabbed for the last pancake, even though it was clearly Farrah's pancake. And Farrah had it on her plate already, and her brother grabbed for it. And Farrah grabbed for it, and the two of them were locked in this heated moment. And Farrah, all of a sudden, she smelled that smell of coming rain, that smell right before rains come, and she could feel this tension building in her body, feel this fear of the altercation that was about to happen, and sure enough, this cloud formed above her head, and this rain started to fall, and she hated the feeling of the rain, she hated the feeling of this tension with her brother, and all of a sudden, there was this huge poing, and quills stuck up straight off the top of her head. This feathered look was ruined, it was shot. And she was even more frustrated because of the lack of her feathered look on her quills, and she stormed out of the house, not finishing her pancakes. She couldn't quite work the quills back down. They were strong and they were pointy, and they showed everybody that something was wrong on her head. And she was on her way to school, and all of a sudden, on her way into school, she was cornered by this group of girls who just looked at her, oozing disdain out of their eyeballs. They almost didn't even have to tease her. They didn't have to say any words. They just looked at her with his head cocked just ever so slightly and tiny little pitiful nod, looking at this spiky bit of hair sticking up on her side. And she felt it, and she could smell as soon as they were approaching, as soon as they were surrounding her, she could smell that smell of coming rain, and a cloud gathered above her head, and all of a sudden the same feeling came, and she started being afraid of what was about to happen, in the same building tension, in the same plang. And another bunch of spikes came out the side of her body, so she had this big cluster of spiky stuff on the top of her head, and this big cluster of spiky squills off the back, and she knew that she couldn't go into school, and so she ran as far as she could, but she didn't make it past the parking lot, and she saw a teacher coming up, a teacher who loved her, a teacher who taught her poetry and love. She had this gift. She had a singular gift for expression, and he wanted to tell her that he knew that she could do so much more, that she was so past where they were in the class, and he wanted to give her more challenges and meet with her and really cultivate her writing. But the second she saw him walking towards her, she could smell that coming rain again, and all this fear built up in her. What's he going to say, she said. I just can't deal with this right now. I can't deal with this. I don't want to. And all of a sudden, even before he had said a single word to her, all of a sudden, prank, more spikes came out of her body, and she was so embarrassed, and she wanted to just curl up into a ball, and so she ran the other direction, ran as far as she could down to the seashore, because she was always calmed by the seashore, and she lived pretty close to it. It was a fascinating ecosystem. Somebody will figure it out. And all of a sudden, it was Alaska. Thank you. She was huddled, clumped into a ball right on the seashore, didn't want to see anybody, and she could smell it again, smell that coming rain in the cloud, and it started to rain down on her, and she just didn't want to feel any of the drops on her face, on her being, and so she crumpled up even tighter, so nothing was showing except for quills. All of the last little soft feathery bits popped up, pow, 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 and now she was a pincushion, her entire body covered in spikes. And she sat there all that day and all into the night. She was cold, and she was hungry, and she was lonely, and she got sadder and sadder, and the rain poured down onto her, and she was so afraid to feel it. She cuddled up even tighter, and the first light of dawn came, and she heard, "Looking good." It was a strange little voice, and she looked over, and there was a sea urchin, tiny little spiky sea urchin, stuck on the shore. And he said, "You got it right. You got it right." She said, "What are you talking about? I got it right. I'm freezing. I'm cold. I feel horrible." He's like, "I haven't felt anything in years." Turns out that years and years and years ago, this sea urchin too was a porcupine, a proud porcupine, but he becomes so shriveled from life, so afraid to feel anything, so afraid of engaging with anyone in love and conflict, that he too had retreated down to the seaside and gotten smaller and smaller and crumpled up more and more, shriveled, shrunk away from life. And she looked at him, and she was petrified. She thought, that's going to happen to me? And she knew what she had to do, and so she squeezed down all of the spines that she could, enough that she could stand up, and she went home. And she didn't quite have the feathered look back, but they were down. They were down a little bit, and still a little bit poofier than she wanted to be, but they weren't quite spucked up. She came to her front door, and she saw her mother coming, and of course her mother was terrified because she hadn't seen her in so long, and her mother came running for her, and the sight of her mother running at her filled her with fear all over again, and she smelled that coming rain, and she felt the cloud gather, and she felt all of her spice go prang, and all of a sudden she was covered in protective shell, and all she wanted to do was shrivel down and hide and protect herself. But instead she knew she had to flip herself back up onto her back, and so she flung herself backwards so her spikes dug into the ground, and she was there open. All of her soft little body open to her mother, who was running towards her so afraid. And even though the clouds gathered and even though the rains fell, she felt the rains on her face for the first time. She knew it was going to be okay. And her mother leaned down, and first she hugged her. And then she yelled at her a lot. When she sat there and felt it and heard it and felt like she saw her mother, knew her for the first time. Amen.